Very, very alarming figures there, Renee, that the NHS now has the longest waiting list, the biggest waiting list in its history. Is there any way out of this crisis? Is there anything the NHS can do to try to see all these desperate people who are desperately waiting for treatment?
I mean, it's just heartbreaking, isn't it, Kevin? Because whilst these are seen as routine operations, the longer that time goes by, the worse that things get. So just as one example, I have a patient waiting for a knee replacement, and her knee is already deformed from the osteoarthritis that she has crippling it. And the longer that goes on and the more it gets deformed, the less likely it will be that that operation will be successful. And she's crippled by it. She can't walk, she can't exercise, she's in constant pain, and she's just one number. And I think orthopedic procedures, hips and knees, etc., have been the ones that have been really hit as well. So these things can wait, but they can't wait, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely.
As GPs, we've seen this coming, and I've been writing about this from March, that this is my big concern. The King's Fund said in December that 4 million referrals had gone missing. So there were 4 million less referrals from GPs to hospitals than they would normally expect. So we have a waiting list of over 4 million people, and we're likely to have an avalanche of new referrals once this horrible COVID has gone. So we have to look to the future. We can't undo what's done, obviously. We're living with what we have. We have to remember that hospitals have had their debts written off. They've got budgets for COVID. So they should actually be in a better position once COVID has gone than they've ever been in to actually ramp up the service and actually do catch-up clinics, catch-up surgeries, and use their theatres 24/7 to get these people done and seen.
Now, obviously, this year is particularly terrible because of the COVID crisis. You know, the numbers of patients going in for that condition are unprecedented. So our traditional winter crisis of the NHS is that much worse this year, but it does happen every year. You know, it's this time last year we were talking about exactly the same thing, and I seem to remember the year before it was a massive story that the NHS was on the point of being overwhelmed because of the traditional Christmas and winter rush, as it were, particularly for respiratory problems. Now, when this crisis is over, Godspeed that day, by the way, but when this crisis is past the worst of it, is it time for us to have a proper look at the NHS generally and perhaps recalibrate the way it's run? Because surely we cannot carry on every year. It gets overrun by all the traditional winter problems and all these other cases that we've just been discussing, the non-urgent cases, the non-urgent surgery, just go by the wayside. It happens every year. We need to organise better, don't we, to stop this happening in the future?
We absolutely do. So let's not forget that the NHS has been, underfunded, and I'm not one of those people that just harps on about underfunding, but it has been underfunded for the last 10 years. We've had a bed reduction across the NHS of about 30,000 beds across that time, which apparently was for efficiency and to speed things up, and that obviously hasn't happened. But there is also massive waste and massive inefficiency in the NHS. We see this as GPs all of the time. We see letters being sent out in triplicate or not at all. We see patients who want to move the appointment of a scan rather than the hospital just saying, okay, let's do it and move it to this date, discharging them back to our care for us to re-refer them in. We see this kind of time wasting, paper wasting, inefficiency all of the time. So yes, there's massive changes that need to happen. It does need to be revamped. People don't like it. They don't want to talk about it. They're too sensitive about it. We have to look at what we offer. We have to decide what we want to offer, what the budget needs to be, and we also need to be brutal in terms of how we actually run those services and what we do within it and how many staff we have at each level.
Yes, I mean, it's refreshing to hear someone like yourself from the NHS telling it like it is. Do you feel it's a problem, a kind of almost cultural problem in this country, that we've come to almost worship the NHS in a religious sense? MPs, politicians dare not tread there. You cannot in any way criticise the NHS as a politician because they fear to do that, because they fear the public will detest them for all this clapping on doorsteps, which, by the way, isn't happening in this lockdown. We have come to venerate the NHS to a ridiculous extent. extent. And it's time now, Renee, to stop venerating it, stop worshipping it, and get real about its very real problems. Would you agree that the religious aspect of that is a problem?
I really do. And I actually wrote to Theresa May about it a couple of years ago and got a really ridiculous, just,
Why am I not
just
surprised?
ridiculous. And I started with that if you actually stood up and said to the public, look, at the end of this conversation, the NHS will be free at the point of service for the rest of your lives for the following things, but then everything else around it we need to talk about, people should listen and come on board. But it has become very difficult. The moment you say, look, we need to look at the service and what we're offering, people start screaming, oh my God, it's privatisation by the back door. Well, if we don't want privatisation by the back door, then we have to have a difficult conversation, because otherwise privatisation by the back door is exactly what we're going to get. So we need to be able to have a grown-up, sensible, non-hysterical conversation, and there's much that can be done.
I mean, do you think, for example, the regular criticism of the NHS is that it is very, very middle management heavy, that a lot of its funds go on great numbers of middle managers with job titles you can't even understand what they mean. They're all earning very nice salaries, and they seem to get in the way of each other and contribute to a massive confusion that delivers notorious inefficiency. Do we need to get to grips with who's working for the NHS? It should be doctors, nurses, people who can treat and cure people. There should be more of them, surely, and fewer of these people doing, indeterminate jobs that we can't work out what they even mean.
Absolutely. That's absolutely one of the problems. But the other issue is that we've actually hived it off into so many little labyrinths rather than being centralised. And I've never been a supporter of centralisation, but I have come back to the view that it is the way to get these mass efficiencies. We have divided up, for example, let's say psychiatry, into 27 different specialities. And I've seen, because I've worked it, so many patients just get lost between each area because they're allowed to be with this speciality for 6 weeks, but then they have to move on to another one if their illness lasts longer than that. And so it goes on. Every single one of those areas has its own back office, its own management, its own structure. We have just created monsters within a monster.
Indeed. And look, everybody has not only sympathy, absolute respect and admiration for all those frontline workers, the doctors, the nurses, the paramedics, who are working their socks off to the point of exhaustion to deal with this coronavirus crisis, with all the patients piling in. Let's get that on the table. They are doing their absolute best. But as an organisation, has the NHS really distinguished itself in this COVID crisis? I mean, I'm thinking of, the Nightingale hospitals, which were dismantled on the basis that they didn't have the staff to man them. Why were they built in the first place? Surely the NHS could have risen to the task and said, well, we'll find some people to man these places. That kind of thing. And the fact that it is on the point of being overwhelmed is the NHS as an organisation really up to the task of dealing with this COVID crisis? Not the staff, but as the organisation that is the NHS.
I think the organisation has handled it very unusually. And I think, as I've said all the way...
What do you mean by unusually? Sorry.
Well, I think the fact that we shut down whole departments in March without any thought at all and left people just, unable to even go for routine blood tests, fertility treatments, sperm samples, that kind of thing. They may sound silly to you and me, but they're not to the people that are suffering and being treated. And those departments just stay closed. They stayed closed all the way through the summer. Ear syringing, for example, in some areas. And it differed area to area. So this was definitely the way that people interpreted instructions from above. So as I've said all the way through, my colleagues have worked their socks off. And I have friends who have been traumatised. This is not about the staff. It is about the instructions from on top and how we handled this. But at the same time, we had so many people come forward and say, look, we've retired as nurses, doctors, physios. We will work again and help you through. Only 1 in 6 of those people actually came to work because they couldn't tick the boxes for diversity training, manual handling, fire safety, the ridiculous list of things they needed to get trained in when we had qualified people offering their help. But at the same time, our MPs have not done their job, in my opinion. I asked my MP 2 weeks ago what he was doing, and he told me categorically that the Nightingales were in use. You and I know that they are empty shells.
No, they're not. They've been dismantled. I mean, they say they're ready to be reconstructed, but if you got, say, what was it, 9,000 beds at the Excel Centre in, or 900 beds, whatever it was, in the Excel Centre in East London, surely you wouldn't just take them away and say it's ready for action, because it's not ready for action. Something very strange went on with this. Can I ask you one other question, Renee, about the NHS or about hospitals? I mean, it is a recorded fact that thousands and thousands and thousands of patients who've gone in to hospital with other conditions have caught COVID-19 while they're in hospital. Who is to blame for that? Because surely that is a scandal.
Well, I think this is really, really difficult. And I think this is something that's going to have to come out in an inquiry, because some of the estimates are that 50% of people are actually catching COVID in hospital. And that is a tragedy, because some of those people will die. And we've seen that in the BBC Hospital documentary that they just did. We saw a patient in there who went in for something else, was just about to be discharged. She tested positive for COVID and she died. And it's tragic. And we have to be able to keep our patients separate if possible. We had Nightingales there. Why did we not consider moving all COVID patients to Nightingales? Or why didn't we consider vice versa? But somehow trying to keep it, more separate than we had, have whole hospitals as COVID and whole hospitals as not COVID. I know one of my local hospitals, Chase Farm, managed to keep itself completely COVID free. So it can be done. It's hard, and I don't pretend for a moment that it's easy, but you can go a long way with really good testing and protocols to do it.
Oncologists in particular have been very worried, claiming that their patients have been kind of neglected throughout this crisis, that the NHS in effect at times became the COVID-only service, and lots and lots of cancer patients did not get the treatment they needed or deserved. Is that a particular problem? And is that something that, again, I think will be examined very closely in a public inquiry? Because there will be a public inquiry, don't worry about that.
I really hope there will be. So this was one of my big issues, and it was actually one of the first articles that I wrote for Pulse magazine that I had come across in a day. 4 patients that were cancer patients. One of them actually had their absolutely treatable cancer surgery, so it was curative, cancelled. One had had his chemo stopped. One had had their scan cancelled, and one actually was mid-treatment and it was going to be delayed. One of those people, I went to their funeral in October because their chemo was stopped. And then you have to think about curative treatment that was stopped in terms of surgery. And I was vilified for this, Kevin, at the beginning by doctors saying I just didn't understand the pressures and this wasn't happening. I wasn't telling the truth, and it was happening. So I think the oncologists that are shouting about this are absolutely right to do so. And it's tragic. Imagine you had cancer and you'd been shielding for a year, and because you didn't get your treatment, and then you did go into hospital and caught COVID. I mean, it all comes together as an absolutely complete mess up.
I should point out an old colleague of mine, only in the last few days, went into hospital for a possible brain surgery. There was a problem with her brain. And she caught COVID in there and died from COVID. So this is happening. It's very real. And as you say, Renee, this will be under the microscope at the inevitable public inquiry. Can we try to end on a positive note that if anything good is to come out of this coronavirus crisis, it is that there will be an opportunity at the end of all this to conduct a root and branch recalibration of the way the NHS works.
I would love to see that happen, and I can always get my letter to Theresa back out of the waste paper bin.
That's where it deserves to be. Renee, thank you so much for your time. Fascinating conversation. Dr Renee Hoenderkamp there. She's an NHS GP and a medical writer, writes for Pulse magazine, as you just heard. Read her stuff. It's very good.